What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So, as you guys will have noticed with the Incredible Hulk, we kind of kicked off this run, so to speak, with the World War Hulk What If story, where he killed all the superheroes and became a Herald of Galactus. I've been wanting to do Incredible Hulk stuff, but what I was trying to figure out was, would you guys be likely to just watch a video that starts a series on Incredible Hulk, or do I just kind of have to grab your attention? Because that's kind of how it is on YouTube these days, for those of you guys who don't know. So as you guys will have noticed with the Incredible Hulk, we kind of kicked off this run with the Incredible Hulk killing all the superheroes and becoming Galactus's herald. And that was really the story that I chose to see whether or not it was possible to initiate a series of videos based on the Incredible Hulk going from Planet Hulk up until the current day when Bruce Banner is replaced by Amadeus Cho. I've been wanting to do the same thing with Thor, and I was debating on going back and forth between Thor's origin story, his new origin story, or something that would be more likely to catch your all's attention. And of course, with YouTube being how it is, the fact that videos show up and people watch, videos at a mile a minute, I kind of figured I had to do something that would basically grab your attention right off the bat. And that's what I'm hoping this does. This is effectively the story of Wolverine and Thor fighting one another. Now, the cool thing about this is that this is a digital exclusive. And what this means is that this is one, only available online, and two, it's self-contained. That's one of the cool things about digital exclusives. Sometimes they tie into an event, but almost rarely does that ever happen. Instead, digital exclusives are designed to be self-contained stories, and they're usually pretty small. This one is in 3 parts, but it's 8 pages each. And so it's effectively a one-shot split into 3 parts. The reason why this is done in a lot of ways is because when people get on and they start reading comic books digitally, it's very easy for individuals to lose attention. And so these stories have to be written and released in a way to where they're just long enough to maintain your attention, but also have content that can keep you coming back. And so by releasing them in, 3 little 8-page segments, it's just enough to keep your attention. And then if you want more, you can go see more. If you don't want more, well, then you just spent 5 minutes reading a comic and that's about it, But the cool thing about this, though, is it also answers a few questions. And what I mean by that is a lot of people, I've seen a lot of different arguments about this, who would win in a fight, Thor or Wolverine? Not only that, how does Adamantium stack up against Uber metal, which is the material that's used to forge Thor's hammer? There we go. But we're actually going to get into this here in a minute, just because of the fact that there's a couple special things about Thor's hammer that you don't normally find in Uru Metal. But this story is actually written by Frank Thierry, and what this does is it initially just kind of picks up with Wolverine, where he's basically passed out in a bar. Now, we wouldn't normally consider this to be abnormal for Wolverine. I cannot talk today. But when he comes to, what is abnormal is that he basically has Lady Deathstrike standing over him. And so because of this, his initial thought is, all right, Lady Deathstrike's trying to kill me. She is trying to do me in yet again. Now, again, Wolverine's response here is par for the course, in the sense that whenever it is that he comes across his villains, the villains attack him for only one of 2 reasons. Either it's because they have just a hatred for him, or because they've been contracted to do so. But it's almost never been a circumstance where Wolverine is confronted by a villain and they're able to basically go their own separate ways. It's usually that they fight, and one of them is trying to kill Wolverine. And so ultimately, if the villain lives, it's because Wolverine allowed them to live and basically walked away. That's usually what happens in his stories. Granted, it's a way to keep those villains coming back, but it's kind of what you run into when you have a character like Wolverine who's so violent and so dangerous and so on. But, of course, using his sense of smell, he also comes to the realization that Lady Deathstrike's not the only one there, that we've also got Omega Red, probably his most formidable villain, since he has the ability to basically neutralize Wolverine's healing factor for a short amount of time. We've got Mr. Sinister, we've got, Bastion, Mystique, so on. I mean, this is a huge kind of, roster of his most notable foes that are going against him. But the real kicker here is that he's met by the arrival of Sabretooth. Now, the reason why this matters is because Wolverine killed Sabretooth, and I think I might cover that story in the future once we get closer to the release of the Logan film. But Wolverine killed Sabretooth, and so to see him come back kind of blows his mind. He's like, where did you come from? Because last I remember, I cut your head off, so I don't understand why you're here right now. More so than that, Sabretooth is... While I would say Omega Red is a little more dangerous, Omega Red doesn't come around that often. So if we were talking about the most dangerous consistent villain of Wolverine, then it would probably be Sabretooth, just because of the fact that Sabretooth is just as agile, he's just as good of a fighter, he's almost as capable as Wolverine is in virtually every sense. And because of that, he's one of the most notable, and if I remember, the original villain for Wolverine. And because of this, it's essentially his worst foe coming back to life. The problem with this is that Wolverine's like, okay, I gotta get out of here and I gotta regroup, because you gotta think about this, Wolverine is basically surrounded surrounded by all of his villains in the same place. I mean, Apocalypse, the whole 9 yards. And so his idea is, okay, we'll get out of here, we'll rethink the situation, come back, kill them all, and then finish my beer. The problem is, when he gets out, we realize these aren't his villains. Instead, it's Thor, who apparently looks like Sabretooth, and just regular individuals who are here. And so Thor comes to the realization that if Wolverine's not stopped, because he's having a hallucination and he's been led to believe that all of his villains have returned, he's basically going to go on a killing spree. Now, the cool thing about this with Frank Thierry is he's actually drawing in a few different sources here. He's drawing in a few different things. The most notable of these is Enemy of the State. Now, Enemy of the State was one of the really popular Wolverine stories, and that's kind of the way it goes with this character, because of the fact that Wolverine is basically just a guy that goes through and attacks stuff. That's all he really does. Finding good stories, or consistently good stories, is a really difficult thing to do. But when you find them, they're really something to behold. Enemy of the State was a story where Wolverine was basically kidnapped and brainwashed by the combined efforts of Hydra and the Hand. Of course, Hydra being a break-off from the traditional Nazi Germany party that was led by Baron von Strucker. They were part science, part let's take over the world. The Hand was the mystical Japanese organization that used magic and wizardry in conjunction with things like resurrection and so on to achieve a multitude of goals, mostly operating from the shadows. But with these two groups working together, which they've done before, but with these two groups working together, they basically turned Wolverine into a killing machine, to the point that he was a literal one-man army facing off against the Marvel Universe. Now, he was stopped, but in the story that I did, Wolverine kills the Marvel Universe. That answered the question of what would have happened if he wasn't stopped, and it just led to him killing all the superheroes on Earth in a way that was very similar to Old Man Logan with regards to him killing the X-Men. But the idea here is that Frank Thierry is kind of invoking this with the sense that Thor sits down and says, okay, look, if Wolverine's not stopped, it could lead to another Enemy of the State kind of situation, and so we've got to bring him to an end. We've got to get him out of whatever hallucination he's having, and we have to bring him back to reality. Now, where Thor is following his tracks and at least locates where the tracks stop, of course he's ambushed by Wolverine. But what Frank Thierry does is he answers the question, here's how Wolverine stands in regards to Thor, both by way of adamantium as well as his fighting style in terms of who would win. Now, this comes from Thor's mouth, so to speak, in terms of how Frank Thierry's writing him, so, take it for what it's worth. But in terms of adamantium versus Uru metal, when Wolverine ambushes Thor, he goes to basically slash his hammer and doesn't damage it. Now, there are a couple reasons for this. One, the fact that the hammer is made of Uru metal, but two, this is not just any form of Uru metal. Thor's hammer is basically designed in a way to where it's amplified by magic, and so it effectively makes the hammer stronger as time goes on. The problem with this is that Wolverine having true adamantium is supposed to be the hardest metal in the Marvel Universe, and so it's kind of like this unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. If Wolverine's true adamantium is the hardest and most durable metal in the universe, then how is it that Thor's hammer can stack up against it? Well, what Marvel says is they say, well, it's just enchantment. It's Asgardian magic. It's basically the fact that this thing has been enchanted over and over again. It's been, seen a multitude of battles. Because of this, it's just a special kind of Uru metal, and in a sense, it's basically unbreakable. It's indestructible. Now, when I say indestructible, I do mean that, it's indestructible against like physical objects. But for example, Molecule Man Owen Reese was able to destroy the hammer by breaking it down on the molecular level. And so that just kind of goes to the fact that it really takes a reality warper to basically destroy Thor's hammer. But at the very least, it shows us that when it comes to, true adamantium versus Uru metal, that true adamantium just doesn't win out here. That Uru metal seems to be able to take the cake. Now, the question we'd have to ask, and this is a question that's not answered here, is if Wolverine sat one of his claws or put one of his claws on the edge of a table and then Thor would have hit his hand with a hammer, would it cause the claw to break in half? Is that possible? Can Uru metal basically destroy adamantium? That question was actually answered in a different story. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but Thor actually started smashing adamantium with his hammer and was able to dent it. And so it seems like from what Marvel's saying, they're more or less equivalent, they seem to be equal in their own form or fashion, that one's not stronger than the other. Is basically, two equal objects smashing into each other. So it creates this kind of weird situation here. But the idea is that, again, as the two of them are going against one another as they're fighting, Wolverine just doesn't seem to be able to snap out of this. He doesn't seem to be able to grasp everything that's going on. And so what Thor says is Wolverine's fighting style is prodigious in terms of his, his stance in combat, his ruthlessness, his speed. This is basically Thor saying that when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, he cannot keep up with Wolverine, just because of the fact that while Wolverine's claws don't really damage Thor as easily as it would a normal person, his claws will kill Thor. And so if Thor doesn't find a way to counter Wolverine's movements, Wolverine will kill him. And so that's effectively Frank Thierry saying, when it comes to traditional hand-to-hand combat, Thor cannot win against Wolverine. And so what Thor does is he basically basically smashes the ground with his hammer, sends Wolverine into a reverie, and then calls down lightning and basically, strikes Wolverine with it to the point that it knocks Wolverine out of his hallucination. And so because of this, Wolverine comes to the realization, okay, I probably should have figured out that Sabretooth wielding a hammer and calling down lightning and flying was an indication this was not Sabretooth, but for whatever reason he didn't. And so once the two of them, begin putting their own noggins to use, so to speak, it's essentially them coming to the realization that Loki is behind all this. Now, this actually has a really funny ending, to be honest. Like, I really love the way the story ends, the way Frank Thierry does this. But what he does is he wraps back around, and he says that, Wolverine had basically been going through Oklahoma. He was in Oklahoma, heard a lot of weird things that were taking place out there, and decided to investigate it. And so once he went to this bar, looked around to figure out if this was something that the Avengers needed to be a part of, that he, went into the bar, he got a drink from the barkeep, only to pass out, and we learned that the barkeep was actually Loki. And so because of this is why Wolverine had basically collapsed at the beginning of this story, leading to Thor getting involved. And so once Thor is like, okay, we got to find a way to stop Loki, then they're suddenly attacked, they're suddenly ambushed by all these different villains. And it's actually really cool because a lot of them are villains that are inherent to Thor himself. So like the Destroyer armor, Enchantress, Valkyrie, or at least people who were villains at one point. There's a version of Thor in the back. It's kind of cool here to see him going against these different foes. The funny thing about this though is that as Wolverine and Thor fight them, each time they basically hit them, they essentially turn to dust and they basically fall away because they were never really here in the first place. And so once Thor and Wolverine come to this realization that none of these guys are really here, their next step is, okay, let's go find Loki. Well, then Thor's like, hey man, sometimes there is no great big scheme. Like sometimes it's not Loki doing some huge scheme. Sometimes Loki does things because he's Loki. And so what Frank Thierry is telling us here is that initiating this whole conflict, forcing Wolverine to hallucinate his villains, having him go against Thor, wasn't because Loki was trying to take over the world. It wasn't because Loki wanted to kill Thor at that point in time. It was really just because Loki felt like being a dick. That was really just the reason why he did this. That's it. It was just Loki just being Loki for a short amount of time. But that's why I say, these little digital exclusives are cool because they're self-contained and they usually have pretty fun stories. They usually have pretty fun endings. I thought this story was really fun. I had a great time reading it. But yeah, it answers a few questions. One of the things that, again, people always want to know was like Adamantium versus Thor's hammer. How does that work out? That kind of thing. But in any event, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. And depending on how this video is received, what we might do is we might turn, what is today, Tuesday? We might turn Tuesday or whatever day this video comes out, we might turn that into like a Thor day. And we just start covering Thor from the time he came back after Ragnarok up until the current day. So you guys can basically follow the Thor chronology and be caught up in what's going on right now with like Unworthy Thor and Jane Foster Thor and all that kind of good stuff and all the things that led up to it. So if you guys like that idea, if you guys want to see more Thor stuff, then make sure you guys drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you all later. Peace.